Today is Friday, October 21st, 2016, and today I want to talk about a very important story that's going on right now over in Southeast Asia. Now, Mr. Rodrigo Duterte, the president of the Philippines, has announced that he's going to no longer deal with the United States militarily or economically, and he's going to focus on dealing with China and Russia instead. Now, this is very big for a few reasons, but before I get into my reasoning, I just want to show you the clip that came from, I think it was in Beijing at a conference with China. And I want you to hear his words for himself. And then once you hear that, we'll come back and I'll give you my final thoughts. So go ahead and roll it.
Your Honors, in this venue, I announce my separation from the United States. Both in military, not maybe social with the Philippines, both in military but economics also. America has lost me. And will I realign myself in your ideological flow, and maybe I will also go to Russia to talk to Putin and tell him that there are three of us against the world: China, Philippines, and Russia. It's the only way.
So you're able to see that now. This is a very, very important announcement because of a few different reasons. But before I get into the reasons, I'm going to give you a little bit of history of the region if you don't know. Now, the Philippines at one point was controlled by the Spanish. This is why a lot of the people that are there, like Mr. Rodrigo Duterte, have kind of halfway Spanish, halfway Asian sounding names because they were controlled by the Spanish up until 1898. Now, that is when they lost, the Spanish that is, they lost to the Americans in the Spanish-American War. So as a result, they had to give up ownership or colonization, whatever you want to call it, of the Philippines. However, right after that, the Americans took it over and then it became America's colony from 1898, 1899 on up until about 1945, which is in the World War II, which I get to a little bit later. Now, when the Americans controlled the Philippines, when they first came, there was a war between the Philippine people and the American people. And that war lasted for a while. Some would say it ended in 1903, 1904, and others would say 1913 because there was a big problem with certain smaller groups of people in the Philippines that were still fighting after the bigger fights were being fought. More specifically, the Moro people, which Mr. Duterte brought up previously when talking about Americans, because the Moro people were like an ethnic minority in the Philippines and they're Muslim, and they got slaughtered by the thousands in a very tragic situation that happened in the Philippines over a period of years. And I think last ended in 1913, but I digress. As American colonialism continues, you got Filipinos getting sent to Hawaii to pick bananas and stuff like that. They were basically using the Philippines as whatever they wanted to use them for, as slave labor, essentially as a staging ground for other things that were going on right there in that region. More specifically, in World War II, they were trying to use the Philippines as a staging ground to fight a war with Japan. Right now, right after Pearl Harbor, 1941, Japan immediately comes and occupies the Philippines because the Americans had a military base there. Right. If the Americans were not in the Philippines, then the Japanese would not have come to occupy them because there was no other reason for the Japanese to be there other than the American presence. What you may not know from looking at a map is that Japan and the Philippines are very close together. Taiwan is like right in the middle of them. But if you look at a map and you kind of zoom in, the northernmost island of the Philippines is only about 250 miles from the southernmost and westernmost island of Japan. Right. You can drive that distance in the state of Virginia here in the United States and not even be through the entire state. You could drive from the ocean front to the mountains, and that's more than 250 miles. Right. So that's a very short distance. And it's most certainly short when you're talking about traveling that distance through air, which you were able to do during World War II. But I digress again. Now, this is important to understand so you get the basic general historical context of what's going on. The Philippines and Vietnam were allies during these conflicts, during World War II, when the Philippines was occupied by Japan, and during the Vietnam War, right? Philippines, they understood what it's like to be occupied by a foreign force. They understood what it's like to kind of be in a situation where you're having a proxy war being fought, because in the Philippines, the war that happened, or the occupation that happened in 1941 to 1945, that was a proxy war between the U.S. and Japan. And the Vietnam War was a proxy war between the U.S. and China. So they understood what it was like to be in a proxy war situation. So they were able to help the Vietnamese by sending troops there, not military troops to fight, but benign forces to send like medical, food, stuff like that. That's what they were there for. And throughout the years, they've always been able to help one another. Vietnam helped the Philippines when Typhoon Haiyan hit in 2013, which destroyed a lot of places in the Philippines, places that are still messed up to this day. Vietnamese Americans, people that were expats of Vietnam and or descendants of people that come from Vietnam, all kind of gathered together in the U.S. and sent aid to the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan, because they remember what happened during World War II, during the Vietnam War, and also just from Vietnam being a communist place, having refugees wash ashore of the Philippines and then be welcomed with open arms. So they're very thankful for that. So they're kind of like allies, and they understand one another in more ways than one. Now, the reason why I bring up Vietnam is because Vietnam was on the opposite side of the South China Sea, which is the whole big picture here. The South China Sea. That is the reason why Duterte went to China to talk, because currently there's a lot of conflict going on in the South China Sea, because what China has done is fortify certain islands that are very far away from their actual mainland coast. And they're claiming these islands as theirs. And you can see a map here on the screen before you. What China has done is fortify those islands, and then they have created what they call the 9-dash line around those islands. And that is what they're claiming is their EEZ and or territorial waters. Now, EEZ, that's an exclusive economic zone. So in that zone, they're able to control whatever goes on, whether that be deep sea exploration for natural resources like gas, whether that be the trade coming through there, through the water and through the air. They're able to control all of what goes on. But as you can see from this map, there are other countries, Vietnam and the Philippines being the main two, that have territorial claims that intersect with the 9-dash line from China. And one of the main things that the Philippines had a beef with China about was the Scarborough Shoal, which is right off the northwest coast of the Philippines. China is claiming that for themselves, but the Philippines is like, hey, that's ours. That's been historically ours. You're getting too close to where we are. We go out there to fish to feed our people. It's to the point now where there's fighting over the fishing. I think a Philippine boat bombed a Chinese boat, not a military vessel, of course, but I think they firebombed a fishing vessel because they were interfering with their ability to be able to fish. There have been fishermen arrested from different countries, Vietnam, China, Philippines, etc., because everybody's kind of stepping on each other's toes. Everybody's in the territorial water and nobody really knows who controls what. The Philippines was able to bring China to an international court, and they were able to actually win a settlement, not a financial settlement as far as I know, but as far as the court saying that China could not fortify these islands and call them their own territorial water, because first of all, historically, that did not belong to them. But second of all, these so-called islands are not islands at all. They're just basically like glorified coral reefs and rocks that China had built up to create islands and say, okay, that's ours. So we control whatever goes on underneath the water that's right there and also around the water. So the international court said they can't do that. However, the Chinese are essentially ignoring the ruling, which still means that there's going to be conflict between them. Now, if you go to the international court and there's a ruling decided and the country is not following it, what's the next alternative? What are you going to do? All you can really do is just try to talk directly to that nation and figure out a way to come to an agreement. And I think that's what's going on here. Or you could go to war, but that's a terrible, terrible thing to do. And the only reason they would go to war is if the United States would kind of provoke them to do it, which is what's going on right now. Today on Friday, October 21st, 2016, I saw that right after Duterte made that announcement, he's going to go to China rather than dealing with the United States. they sent a destroyer right out there to the South China Sea. Now China's saying, hey, you need to back off. This is our water. This is our territorial water. Back off. And the reason why the U.S. is doing it, well, they'll say the reason why is because they want to make sure that they have freedom of movement out there in the South China Sea, because by international law, it's illegal if you're not allowing people to be able to have freedom of movement. However, the real reason why they want to have so-called freedom of movement and the reason why they want to inject themselves into that conflict is because a lot of our raw materials comes from the South China Sea, not as far as in the water right there, but as far as the trade route, right? It comes from, Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc., through the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, the northern Indian Ocean, right along the coast of India, on up past Sri Lanka, up to the coast of Bangladesh and on down Myanmar, Thailand, etc., and then on down through certain choke points, like right there in between Malaysia and Indonesia, right there where Singapore is, and then up through the South China Sea. Now, they can't really go through the Indian Ocean where it's just like, like a direct shot from Southern Africa, like South Africa or Angola on over to Australia, because there's nothing out there. You need to have some kind of land that's close by in case of something happening, because if you get caught in a storm right there in the middle of the Indian Ocean, they'll never ever find you. And you also can't go north. Well, you can go north, but it's not really available yet, if I'm not mistaken. And Russia is claiming that part up there in the Arctic Pass, right? And that's actually contested as well. I think some of the Nordic countries are kind of contesting that because they say that, some of that is passing in their territorial water, but Russia's like, no, that's ours. But that's a whole different story right there. There are a lot of conflicts that are going on, but the South China Sea, that is very important because a lot of raw goods goes through there that comes to the U.S. because a lot of our products, unfortunately, come from China, and that trade route is very important, not only from goods that come from China, but goods really that come from the Middle East, such as energy. So the U.S. wanted to use the Philippines as a staging ground to be able to fight any kind of proxy war that may erupt if China was able to successfully claim the 9-dash line, demarcation line, and anything that's in there, because they would want to get that route open to be able to continue trade. But Duterte is like, look, we saw what happened in World War II when the Americans were here, and then we got attacked by the Japanese, and we had a very bloody war that killed thousands, if not millions, of Filipinos. So why go through that again? China, of course, is not perfect. They have so-called human rights violations, about they sell organs and stuff like that, allegedly. It's not a perfect place. It's very polluted. They do a lot of currency manipulation, etc. However, at this point, I think that Duterte kind of sees the writing on the wall. He's like, look, I'd rather just do with China and Russia, which are very strong, and they're becoming more powerful in the world. They become more of an influence rather than the Anglosphere in the West, which is declining. You see what's going on right now with our economy. We're $20 trillion in debt, and China owns most of that debt. You see what's going on right now with Europe. A lot of these countries are failing. The European Union seems like it might be on the ropes. You had the UK just exited. So you might have France next, and then you have the horde of Islamic invasion coming into Europe. So Europe has its own problems. So does the West in general, especially the US and Canada. So really, when you're talking about a war, which side are you going to be on? Are you going to be aligned with the Anglosphere in the West, or are you going to be aligned with the Asians, the Russians, etc.? Who's stronger and what makes more sense? You got to go with the Asians. You got to go with China and Russia. It just makes more sense logically for its people, because if you decide to align with Americans, you will be in a proxy war, and it will be very bloody. There still could be a proxy war even if they are aligned with China, but I think that the chances of that are less, and if it did happen, there will be less casualties. So I think that's kind of what Duterte is kind of banking on. And the only beef they have in the South China Sea really is a Scarborough Shoal because of the fishing. Now, if they're able to kind of go to China, talk to Xi Jinping and get that worked out, then they'd be good to go. And beyond just the Anglosphere in the West kind of declining, there's also a problem with the media attention on Duterte, trying to label him as a dictator or a genocider and stuff like that, when that's not really the truth. What's going on is that the media in the West is painting him as that, as something to talk about. They're just trying to have it's really about money, because the media is failing. A lot of newspapers, online media, etc., is kind of grasping for straws. And if you're able to kind of paint a world leader or somebody of a different country in a negative light and able to get a lot of attention, then they'll do it. And it's really petty to do things like that, but it really impacts people because of the whole situation where they said that he called Obama a son of a whore, which was not true. That was a mistranslation. He was talking to a journalist in the actual place that asked him a question kind of out of turn. He was talking to that journalist when he referred to the journalist as that, but the media took it as saying that he was calling Obama that because of the context in which it was said and the way it was translated. But that's not what happened. But the media, of course, is going to run with it. And even when they find something that kind of goes against what was said, they're not going to retract it because they were able to get their clicks. They were able to get their views. They were able to get their attention and their money from the ad dollars, so they don't care. Now, things like that seem very petty, like I said, but they impact people because there was a meeting with Southeast Asian nations in Laos, and Duterte was there, and so was Obama. But Obama canceled the meeting he had with Duterte because of the media remarks. So it's like, man, what's going on here? Not only are you failing in the West, in the Anglosphere, you're also letting the media control how you operate, control how you talk to me diplomatically. So what kind of person is that? Why would I go into a war with somebody like that who can't even control his own ability to discern what's fact and fiction from the news media? It doesn't make any sense. At least with China, I could sit down and talk to Xi Jinping and he's not going to be controlled by the media or outside forces. He's not perfect, but he's better than Obama and the failing Western society. And also they talking about how Duterte is some kind of genocider because of the whole situation with the drug war, when there's been like 3,000 people that have been killed in so-called extrajudicial killings. But there's no evidence of those killings not being justified because many of the killings have been police fighting drug dealers who are fighting them back. Duterte is trying to fight against the drug dealers and the drug pushers and the abusers in the community in his country because he does not want to become another former Spanish colony in Mexico with the very bad drug problem, and to the point where the country is being controlled by the narcos, by the drug dealers. Not only just the violence that goes on between drug cartels, but also the public health aspect of it. I mean, you're dealing with a poor country. You're dealing with hospitals that are being overrun. There's a rehab place for drug addicts, but there's not enough money to fund it. So it's like, okay, what's the best solution here? Let's kind of stamp out the drugs and work with China because a lot of the drugs come from China. So let's let them help us to be able to eliminate the drug problem rather than just doing what the West says, which is just letting it happen and not dealing with the criminal aspect and not dealing with the drug problem at all, which, by the way, the West promised to help deal with, but they did not help. So if they won't help with the drugs, if they will let the news media control how they behave, if they'll do all these things, what makes him think that they're going to help him in the war situation is going to jump off between the Philippines and China, Russia, and all their allies? The Philippines will be decimated, and then who's going to be to blame? You're going to put the blame on Duterte for not protecting his people. So the best thing he did here was what he did. So what do you think? Do you think that this situation is something that had to happen the way it happened? And when I say that, I mean, when you're dealing with China and they're kind of threatening you a little bit, they're kind of dealing with a little bit of a conflict and you're a small nation, what do? Do you decide to just try to talk to them to work things out peacefully, or do you try to fight? Or are you a Filipino? Are you in the Philippines right now? Do you live in the United States, Canada, etc., and you're Filipino, you're kind of the expat, a descendant of a Filipino immigrant or whatever you are? What is your viewpoint on it? How do you feel about Duterte and his fight on the drug war? How do you feel about the so-called extrajudicial killings? How do you feel about the situation going on in South China Sea? Whatever your comments are, let me know in the comments below. And that's all I got to say for this video. If you like what you heard, please comment, rate, share, and subscribe. Peace.
Instead of helping us, ang unang tumira itong State Department. So, you can go to hell. Mr. Obama, you can go to hell. EU, better choose purgatory. Puno na sa impyerno. Bakit ako matakot sa inyo?